rather complementary. Nevertheless, the balance between them was delicate and easily upset, and the possibility of a certain tension present. You'll remember that we spoke at the end of our period of the everlasting covenant that God had made with David. This we saw was basically a promissory covenant. It was in effect a binding promise on the part of God that having chosen Mount Zion as the seat of his earthly rule, he would dwell there forever among his people, defending them from their foes. That he would give to David a dynasty that would never end. True, there was the understanding that a sinful king might bring chastisement on himself and his people, but no condition attached to the promise itself. The dynasty will endure, secure in the promises of God. Now, such a theology must have engendered an enormous sense of confidence in the people. True, it allowed for the possibility that the nation might have to face troubles, reversals, problems, as all nations do. But there would be, in the final analysis, no ultimate need to worry about the future, for the future is secure. Indeed, in difficult times, it gave rise to a reaching out toward the future, toward victory, recovery of the lost glories of the past. Well, this was, after all, what was affirmed in the covenant that the future held. Now let us repeat it. This is in no sense to be called an eschatology. It did not look for any consummation of the divine purpose in history, no new order that God would create. Rather, it was a sublime confidence in the continuance and the ultimate triumph of the existing order, which might well lapse into complacency. On the other hand, we observe the Sinaitic covenant, a covenant which had never been forgotten in Israel, though doubtless obscured in the minds of many in Judah by the official theology of Yahweh's election of Zion and David. This covenant ought to have allowed no complacency whatever with regard to the future. It followed the pattern of a suzerainty treaty. It offered no unconditional promises whatever. Rather, it demanded of the lesser party in the covenant implicit obedience to the divine overlord's stipulations under threat of his extreme displeasure. Far from leading to complacency, such a theology would think would lead the nation to continual self-examination and penitence. And yet it would seem that by the 8th century, the whole concept of covenant had been widely externalized and prostituted. The notion seems to have established itself that its stipulations could be met by sacrifice and cultic observance alone. And since this was being done, might one not be confident that the God-people bond was being maintained and the divine favor thereby assured? And in dangerous times, men could look forward to a great day of Yahweh, when he would come once again with awesome power to the aid of his people, defend them from their foes. Now let us say it again. This hope of the day of Yahweh was in no sense an eschatology. It did not look for the consummation of the divine purpose in history or some new order that God would create. Rather, it was the confidence that as in the past, so in the future, God would come to the aid of the existing order, would defend it and secure his people in the possession of the promised blessings. Now, such complacency was a facile, fragile thing, one must agree. It might survive through times of prosperity or limited emergency, but it couldn't possibly survive the 8th century. That's not our job to sketch the history of the period. Enough to say that the latter half of the 8th century saw the beginning of Assyria's period of empire, and therewith a time of sheer terror for the petty states of Western Asia. Assyria, long a menace on the horizon, had now come to conquer, to occupy, and to rule. The little states of the area had just one choice: give in and give tribute, or resist and die. Northern Israel chose to resist, and within 25 years had been wiped from the map. Judah submitted and yielded tribute and so survived, but she wasn't going to be a free country again for another 100 years. When late in the 8th century Hezekiah attempted rebellion, it was put down to the accompaniment of a frightful bloodbath in the best Assyrian tradition. It was a time of shameful servitude, onerous taxation, the forced recognition of Assyria's gods even in the temple itself, and the ever-present threat of Assyrian reprisals for the least attempt to alter the situation. The great-grandchildren of men alive when it began wouldn't see the end of it. Now, in such a time, facile optimism with regard to the future would have no place. The events gave the lie to whatever optimistic confidence may have existed. Obviously, God is not always going to come to the defense of the country. Obviously, he's not always going to give the Davidic king victory over his foes and a wide domain. The Davidic king is a helpless vassal, the lackey of a foreign power. And what shall one say of God's kingly and worldwide rule on Mount Zion when he has to move over and make place for other gods in his very own house? What indeed? The popular confidence in the promises of God and his continuing protection must have seemed questionable in the face of what the nation was undergoing. Some profounder explanation of God's dealings with his people and what the future had in store to them urgently needed. And if this had not been given, it is difficult to see how any conclusion could logically have been drawn, say that Yahweh is powerless or faithless to his promises. And surely, if any hope for the future is to be offered at all, it has to be something more profound than facile assurance that God will always defend this nation. Providentially, it was just at this moment that the first of the great prophets stepped upon the scene, and they brought the needed word. Now, the prophets were of all things not facile optimists. Indeed, their word was, first of all, not a word of promise at all, but a word of judgment. They were rooted in the sacred traditions of the past, if anything more deeply than their contemporaries were, but they rejected the popular hope drawn from those traditions completely. Indeed, they made those very traditions the basis and the norm of their evaluation of their national character and policy, and in the light of them saw the nation as under the judgment of God and heading for disaster. And when they attempted to describe the disaster that was coming, they very frequently seized upon those very traditions which had been the foundation of the national hope and stood them on their head. Remember how Amos upended the popular hope of the day of Yahweh. But the prophets did not see the judgment as entailing the revocation of promise as the end. All of them had hope for the yet farther future, though some of them, like Amos, had very little to say about it. But this hope did not lie in straight line continuity with the existing order, as the popular hope did. It lay beyond a radical break, God's judgment on the present order, and it would come to pass through a new divine act in the yet farther future, which would restore the broken relationship between God and people and bring his purposes for them to a conclusion. And to describe this final divine act, once again, they reach back to those factors in the national tradition that had been the basis of its self-understanding and projected them on the future as patterns of God's final provision for his people. And just here we may see the beginning of eschatology in the sense we defined it yesterday. For this new divine act, though described in terms of patterns drawn from the past, was not a mere repetition of the past, a putting of things back like they used to be. It was a new divine act that would exceed the past, that would make actual the true intention of the past on a profounder level. And it was to be something final. It would endure forever. It would never end. But in view of what has been said, it is hardly surprising that the eschatology of the 8th century prophets did not follow one single pattern, but several. At the risk of oversimplification, of which I am keenly aware, we may say that two stand out, corresponding to the two patterns of covenant that we have already observed. On the one hand, we see a reaching back to the traditions of Exodus, Sinai, land giving, the old tribal league, which saw the immediate future as the bringing down of the covenant curses on the nation, the destruction of the nation, ejection from its land, to be followed in a yet farther future by a new act which would amount to a new land giving and a restoration of the covenant bond on a deeper level. And on the other hand, we see a reaching back to the traditions of Jerusalem and David, which saw the immediate future in terms of a terrible chastisement to be followed in the farther future by God's vindication of his kingly rule on Mount Zion under a coming Davidic king. Now, the first of these patterns finds its classical expression in North Israel's great prophet Hosea. To be sure, Amos' preaching was likewise rooted in the traditions of Exodus and land giving and in the stipulations of covenant law. Amos, of course, preached at the mid-8th century before the storm broke, at a time when Israel had reached heights of power and wealth unknown since the days of Solomon. He spoke to a nation proud of its strength, untroubled by external threat, confident of the future. He addressed an affluent society which enjoyed every luxury money could buy, yet a sick society. At the top, the privileged rich; at the bottom, the hopelessly poor. And the rich not only careless of the plight of the poor, but missing no opportunity to crowd them, enslave them, and rob them of their rights. Now, Amos' attack upon the crimes of society is too well known to require review. It's the classic prophetic attack, and the note dominates his book. Are these that turn justice to poison, thrust righteousness down to the ground? They hate him who advocates in the court, abhor him that speaks with integrity. Or again, are these easeful ones in Zion, complacent ones in Samaria's mount? And he goes on, who drink wine by the bowl and anoint themselves with the finest of oils. But over the fracture of Joseph they are not sick. You know that note dominates the book of Amos. But Amos did not speak out of personal indignation or outrage. His social attack was marshaled on a platform of theology. Although Amos never uses the word covenant, the crimes he attacks were clearly violations of covenant law, and as such he views them and rebukes them. And on occasion he will throw these crimes against the backdrop of Yahweh's grace in bringing his people from Egypt and giving them the promised land, the very events which were the basis of their obligation to him. Thus, in the great sermon in chapters 1 and 2, as it rounds to its conclusion and it wheels upon Israel, the three crimes of Israel, yes, before, I'll not revoke it, because they sell innocent men for money, and the needy by a legal fiction, and so on and so on. Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, etc., etc. It was I who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. The very things that should have created a sense of obligation have failed to do so, and therefore their crime is doubly heinous as a crime against grace. And the cult by which they hope to placate God is offensive to him. I hate, I despise your pilgrim feasts. Take no pleasure in your high holy days. Though you bring me burnt offerings and meal offerings, I'll not accept them. And to the peace offerings of your fat animals, I'll pay no attention. Beg away from me the noise of your songs. I'll not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like water, righteousness like a perennial stream. Now Amos therefore completely rejected the popular confidence that because Israel was God's chosen people, God would always protect her. Yes, he said, Israel has been elected and has received the divine grace, and it is just because she has been that she will be judged for her crimes. Hear the word that Yahweh has spoken against you, people Israel, the whole family that I brought up out of the land of Egypt. You only have I known, that's an election word, out of all the families of the earth. Therefore I'll punish you for all your crimes. Amos did not regard Israel as a pet people. On the contrary, the God who judges the other nations will judge Israel also. He will declare holy war against her in his great day of Yahweh, smite her armies with panic, 9 times decimate them. And Amos' message of judgment, as you know, reaches its thundering climax. Behold, the eyes of Lord Yahweh are on the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from off the face of the earth. But did Amos have no hope for the farther future? I believe that he did. But one must admit it does not play much role in his book. Only the 2 little sayings at the very end, which are a critical problem into which we cannot go, and otherwise nothing but what one scholar has aptly called a faint-hearted perhaps. Seek good and not evil, that you may live, that Yahweh, God of hosts, may be with you as you've said he is. Hate evil, love good, establish justice in the court. It may be that Yahweh of hosts will be merciful to what's left of Joseph. And there we have to leave Amos on that somewhat ambiguous note. But with his contemporary Hosea, the case is clear as crystal. Hosea was steeped in the traditions of the Sinaitic covenant through and through. The Davidic covenant meant not a thing to him. Indeed, you could argue from some of his sayings that he was opposed to the institution of monarchy as such. I would doubt it, but you can argue. Not like Amos, Hosea spoke to a nation that was dying. Though he began to speak in the heyday of Jeroboam's reign, his career continued into the dark years that followed, years in which the nation, inwardly rotten, facing the threat of Assyria, exploded into anarchy and civil war. King followed king, rapidly, usually by assassination, as one party after another snatched for the power, and the national policy swung this way and that like an unhinged pendulum, and law and order broke down. You can see all this on the pages of Hosea's book. Now Hosea's attack fell upon the apostasy from Yahweh, specifically the practice of the fertility cult with which the land was filled. Said he, wine, new wine, take away the understanding. My people inquire of a thing of wood, their stick gives them oracles. A spirit of whoredom has led them astray. They've left their God to play the whore. They sacrifice on the tops of the mountains, make offerings upon the hills, under oak and poplar and terebinth, because their shade is good. Therefore your daughters play the harlot, your brides commit adultery. I'll not punish your daughters when they play the harlot, nor your brides when they commit adultery, for the men themselves go aside with the sacred prostitutes. The fertility cult has poisoned the national character through and through. And Hosea abused this departure from Yahweh to worship other gods as a violation of the cardinal stipulation of his covenant. Indeed, on occasion he depicts Yahweh as launching his covenant lawsuit against his people. Hear the word of Yahweh, people Israel. Yahweh has a reeb, that's a lawsuit, with the inhabitants of the land for no faithfulness, no kindness, no knowledge of God in the land, nothing but swearing, lying, killing, stealing, committing. He's taking off the Decalogue, the stipulations of the covenant, it would seem. And he goes on to say that the land is therefore under the curse. Now Hosea, as you well know, introduced into Old Testament prophecy the figure of marriage to describe the covenant bond. Whatever may have suggested this figure to Hosea, it was certainly shaped in his mind by his own tragic experience, for however one interprets the first 3 chapters of his book, it would seem that his wife was not faithful to him. Just so, said Hosea, Yahweh has married Israel in the covenant bond. And as any man would expect of his wife, he expects of her absolute faithfulness to him. But in worshiping other gods, Israel has committed adultery. And since pleading with her has done no good, the future she must face is divorce, ruin. Plead with your mother, plead. For she's not my wife, I'm not her husband. Let her put away her harlotry from before her, her adultery from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked, set her as in the day she was born. This is a divorce action. The offending adulterous wife would, one thinks on occasion, be seized by her husband, led to the door of the house, stripped naked and booted out. Go, you are not my wife. God is going to divorce Israel. And since Israel has broken his covenant, Hosea pronounced his judgment upon her and turns every bit as strong as those used by Amos. You'll remember that in chapter 1, his wife bore 3 children, to each of whom he gave symbolic names. And the youngest he named Lo Ammi, not my people, explaining it, called his name Lo Ammi, for you're not my people, and I'm not your God. Anyone knows that the formula, I will be your God, you shall be my people, is the formula of covenant. He could not have said more plainly, the covenant is void. You're not my people, I'm not your God. So with a fury that beggars description, Hosea calls down the covenant curses on the nation. For instance, in chapter 9, as we find them there, Ephraim's glory shall fly like a bird, no birth, no pregnancy, no conceiving. Even if they rear children, I'll bereave them till none is left. Woe to them when I depart from them. To which Hosea adds, give them, Yahweh, what wilt thou give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. The curse of the covenant is upon the nation. And Hosea declared that none of their political maneuverings or frantic attempts can save them. They will be sent into exile, ripped from their land, and destroyed. And when Hosea speaks of the judgment that is coming, occasionally he does so in terms of a new wilderness wandering, even a new Egyptian bondage. The patterns of the past, which had been the foundation of the nation's self-understanding, have now become types of the judgment to come. It is as if the entire Heilsgeschichte had been stood on its head and reversed, back to the beginnings again. And yet Hosea clearly held out hope for the farther future. And this hope did not rest in the confidence that Israel would repent and avert the judgment. If Hosea entertained that hope, apparently he was forced to surrender it. Indeed, Hosea's hope did not rest in Israel at all, or anything that she would do, but rather in the very character of God, who beyond the judgment is still there. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How hand you over, Israel? How make you like Admah, treat you like Seboim, the cities destroyed with Sodom and Gomorrah? My heart recoils within me, my compassion grows warm and tender. I'll not execute my fierce anger, I'll not again destroy Ephraim. Why? I'm God, not man. The implication is, if I was a man, I'd let him have it. But I am not a man subject to human anger and grudges. And that Hosea looked for a hope beyond the judgment is clear. And when he articulated that hope, it was in terms of a new coming out of the wilderness into the land and a restoration of the covenant bond. Therefore, look, I will allure her, the faithless wife, bring her into the wilderness, and there speak to her heart. There I will give her vineyards, make the valley of Ahor into a door of hope. You remember in the Joshua narrative, that was the place where Achan, who had stolen the devoted goods of Jericho, was condemned, and Israel was under the curse. Now it becomes a Pt.2, a door of hope. Then she shall answer as in the days of her youth, as in the days when she came out of Egypt. The idyllic days of betrothal and wedlock will become back again, and then I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness, in justice, in gracious favor, and in mercy. I'll betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know Yahweh. Now Hosea did not come out and say, I will make a new covenant with you. He's speaking in the metaphor of betrothal and marriage. But that is precisely what he actually has said. And the looking out for a new covenant begins, so far as we know, at this point. But we shall have to hurry on. The other eschatological pattern that we have mentioned finds its classical expression, you have guessed it, in Isaiah of Jerusalem, who prophesied all through the dark days of the Assyrian invasions. Isaiah was rooted and grounded in the theology of Zion and David. This was indeed the theological basis of his lifelong criticism of the nation's policy, and without it, that critique does not even make sense. At first glance, Isaiah's political advice seems so self-contradictory that we attempted to put him down as a changeable man who couldn't make up his mind, a regular weathercock of a man who trimmed his message to every political wind that blew. In his young man opposing submission to Assyria, later on several occasions opposing resistance to Assyria, and finally when the chips were down and all seemed lost, counseling defiance of Assyria. And yet a single theological line runs through all of this and ties it together. Isaiah's call at all times to his nation was that it trust in the sure promises of God to David, and that it orientate its policy on this theological basis. This is quite evident in the first political crisis of Isaiah's career, which broke out only a few years after he had begun to preach as Ahaz took the throne in Judah. A coalition was formed to resist Assyria, the leaders of which were Rezin, king of the Aramean state of Damascus, and Pekah ben Remaliah, who had usurped the throne in northern Israel. The Confederates wanted Judah to join them. In a business like this, you can't have net neutrals to your rear. But Ahaz, apparently sensing the danger of it, wanted no part of it and declined. Whereupon the coalition moved against him. They would give him a proper hazing. They would beat him into line. Nay more, they would take him from the throne and replace him with a creature of their own choosing who would be amenable to their wishes. The continuance of the eternal dynasty was in question, and the promises were at stake. And as it says in Isaiah 7, Ahaz's heart trembled as the trees of the forest tremble in the wind. He was in a box and he didn't know what to do. He could see nothing to do but to send tribute to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and make himself his vassal and beg his aid. And so he did against Isaiah's advice, sending tribute with the message, "I'm your servant and your son. Come up and save me. I'm your boy. I'm your dutiful vassal. Now come and save me," which of course Tiglath-Pileser was glad of a diplomatic excuse to do. He'd done it anyway, but he was glad to do it in proper form. Now Isaiah on that occasion, see chapter 7 and 8, met the king as he was inspecting his water supply in preparation for the siege. And he gave him the message in effect, "Your Majesty, get hold of yourself, keep calm. Don't be afraid of these burnt-out faggots of men who are attacking you. God did not ordain what they propose, and it will not happen." So he goes on to say, the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Ben Remaliah. And to these rather in themselves meaningless words, he probably wished the king to think in yet another couplet. And the head of Judah is Jerusalem, and the head of Jerusalem is Ben David. These little pipsqueaks will never usurp David's throne. And then he concludes, if you won't believe, surely you won't be established. But how to catch that Hebrew pun, im lo aminu ki lo te amenu. If you won't stand firm, you won't be stood firm. Put your feet down on the theological affirmations that you so piously repeat in church, Your Majesty, and make your policy on the basis of them. And then Isaiah, we can't stop on it, went on to give the famous but cryptic Emmanuel saying, which would surely remind the king of one of the psalms used in his own cult. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our refuge. Yahweh Sabaoth Emmanuel, same thing, you see. The king was invited to act upon the very theology that he affirmed in church, and not to fear. Of course, he refused to do it. But the same thing motivated Isaiah down through his later life when he opposed rebellion against Assyria. This was true just after Hezekiah took the throne, and a rebellion broke out in the Philistine towns Ashdod with Egyptian backing, and ambassadors waited on Hezekiah asking him to come in. Isaiah opposed the whole thing. He walked about town naked and barefoot, symbolical of what would happen to those that trusted in Egypt. And he gave this word when the ambassadors appeared. What will one answer the messengers of the nations? This: Yahweh has founded Zion. In her his poor people find refuge. Orientate your policy theologically. And then still later, after Sennacherib came to the throne of Assyria, rebellion did break out with Egyptian backing, and Judah was in it hand in glove. Isaiah opposed it hotly, and for the same reasons. The nation has trusted in Egyptian military power when it ought to have trusted in Yahweh. It has formed its policy on the basis of coalitions and realpolitik when it ought to have formed it on the basis of faith. As he says, chapter 30, "Oh, the rebellious children, Yahweh's word, who carry out a plan, not mine, who make a league, not inspired by me, that they may add sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking my counsel, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh, to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt." Now it's sure it can't be a coincidence, those two words translated protection, shelter, the same roots as those found in the great Zion hymn, which the king had certainly heard in the temple. God is our refuge and strength, a well-tried help in time of trouble. Therefore will we not fear, though the earth should shift and the mountains slip into the depths of the sea, etc. In church you said God is our refuge and strength, but now your policy says Pharaoh is our refuge and strength. And that's hypocrisy. He goes on, chapter 31, "All these that go down to Egypt for help trust in horses, rely in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because strong indeed. But look not to the Holy One of Israel, nor consult Yahweh." Now the Egyptians are men, not God. Their horses are flesh, not spirit. And he goes on to say that Yahweh takes action, both helper and helpee will go down in a ball together. Undoubtedly the king had recited the royal psalm in his coat. Some boast of horses, some boast of chariots, but we boast in the name of Yahweh our God. But now his policy says our trust is in horses and chariots. And so Isaiah could only pronounce disaster for the coalition and its ventures. And when Sennacherib struck in the year 701 and left the country a bloody pulp, Isaiah could only see that as the chastisement of God upon it for its refusal to act in faith. And yet, at whatever time and under whatever circumstances, Sennacherib had the city at his mercy, and it looked as if the jig were up indeed. Isaiah stood by his king and said in effect, "Your Majesty, don't be afraid of that loudmouth out there. He will never be allowed to get in. For, says Yahweh, I will defend this city and save it for my own sake and the servant David's sake." And although we do not know the precise historical circumstances, the Assyrians did not take Jerusalem. The city was saved as Isaiah had promised. So Isaiah's rootage in the Zion David tradition is clear, but this must not lead us to suppose that he was ignorant of the stipulations of Yahweh's covenant law, as some have thought. True, references to the Exodus are rare in the Isaiah book, just two, and both disputed, probably because they do refer to the Exodus. But his attack on the crimes of society runs exactly parallel to that of Amos and has a similar motivation. as does his attack upon the lavish but empty cultus. But nowhere more plainly do we see that Isaiah understood the God people bond as one based in the prior grace of God and issuing in stringent obligations, as was true in the Sinaitic covenant, and we see it in that matchless song of the vineyard in chapter 5. Ashira nali didi, shirat dodi lakarmo, kerim hayali didi, bakerim ben shemin. It's worth studying Hebrew just to read Isaiah in the original. He was a master stylist. He could boot the Hebrew language around because he commanded it. At any rate, he seems to be at a vineyard festival, and glad songs are going up everywhere. And Isaiah, as it were, proposes, let me sing one of my own now. And he sings about a friend who had a vineyard, it would seem, excellently placed on a sunny, fertile hill, and the friend had lavished all care upon it, plowing the ground, clearing it of stones, protecting it with a wall and a watchtower, etc. And he expected a handsome yield. As Isaiah said, he looked for it to yield grapes. Let me translate literally, but it yielded stinkers, rotten grapes. Isaiah then turns to his hearers and said, now, let's argue this. What would you do if you had a vineyard like that? Was there anything I could have done that wasn't done? Obviously not. What would you do with it? Well, I'll tell you what I'll do with that vineyard. I'll cut down the hedge and overturn the wall and let the cattle in, and they'll eat it. And then he drops the mask finally. For the vineyard of Yahweh of hosts is the house of Israel, the men of Judah his pleasant plantation. And he looked for justice, mishpat, but there bloodshed, mispah, for righteousness, tzedakah, but see an outcry, tzedakah. You simply can't translate a man that plays with words like that. But it's quite clear that whatever Isaiah's future of the nation was, he did not believe it would be defended no matter what. One can really say that in Isaiah, the Davidic and the Sinaitic traditions are in tension and are brought into balance by stress upon the possibility of chastisement indigenous in the Davidic tradition, a standard feature, as you know. And in principle, no limit was set upon how severe that chastisement might be, short of the fall of the dynasty. In Isaiah, the chastisement assumes the proportions of national disaster. National disaster. And it is interesting that when he attempted to warn of that disaster, on several occasions, he reached back to the traditions of great David and stood them on their head. For instance, in chapter 28, and I cannot refer to more than this, he has warned of the national policy, and he has begged the people to come to their senses. Said he, the bed is too short to stretch on, the cover too narrow to wrap in. You ever been in that pickle on a cold night? There's simply nothing you can do. The nation has worked itself into a trap. And he begs the people to come to their senses, for Yahweh will rise as on Mount Perazim, will rage as in the vale of Gibeon, to do his deed, strange his deed, to work his work, alien his work. Now the two references to Baal Perazim, the vale of Gibeon, are surely references to the two victories in 2 Samuel 5, whereby David took the back of the Philistines and drove them forever from Israelite territory. Now God will act again as he did in David's day, but this time in judgment. And yet one can see, severe though the catastrophe is that Isaiah looked for the destruction of his nation and the end of the Davidic dynasty. Assyria he saw as the instrument of God's judgment, but only an instrument, and will not be allowed the last word in history. Assyria, rod of my anger, staff of my fury is in their hand. Against a godless nation I send him, against the people of my wrath command him. But Assyria, he said, never got the point. Assyria rather thought she was acting autonomously as the power in the world. And Isaiah says, isn't that rather like an axe getting the notion it's doing the chopping? That Assyria and its blasphemous, overweening hubris will itself be brought low. So the judgment comes as a chastisement, a terrible chastisement, but still a chastisement. It is a judgment designed to purify and to bring forth a remnant. Now, the remnant does not occupy the space in Isaiah's book we often like to think, mentioned rather rarely. But that it was fundamental in Isaiah's thought is clear, at least, from the fact that he named his oldest boy Yashub. A remnant will return. The name has polarity. It can be read two ways, depending upon which of the Hebrew words, subject or verb you address. It can be a threat. A remnant is going to get back only. I warn you, if on the verb, a remnant will return. I assure you, it's played both ways in Isaiah's book. So the judgment has a purifying purpose. This, though Isaiah never lived to see it happen, was his lifelong hope, classically expressed in chapter 1. I will vent my wrath on Assyria. I will tell you, remove all your alloy, and you shall be called city of faithful. Judgment then exercises purifying thought. Now, it's perfectly expressed. We have Isaiah's rootage in the Zion, so we're not surprised that it has should thought pattern. In Isaiah, the messianic hope, the kingly ideal, its first positively classical expression. I wish we had time to go, but read the great passages in the first part of 9 and chapter 11, and read Isaiah's promise of redemption, of every respect royal ideal, to whom all the dynastic promises made actual. In conclusion, is not a mere of the popular. It's not a hope for this nation. Is lie in continuity with the existing order as the goal toward which the national history is naturally moving. It stands in discontinuity with the existing order. God's judgment on the in the official theology is a theoretical possibility, but is expressly affirmed and announced. And the king shall come, for exceeds all that might have been expected and affirmed on their day. It is the expectation of a king who corresponds to the king by God. And there, of course, began that restless search for him who shall come. Disappointed, so thrusting men out ahead and finding, so Christians assert, its only fulfillment when angelic voices announced to you this day there is born in the city of David a Savior who is Messiah, Messiah the Lord. But we'll have to stop there. Thank you.
see that we appreciate your making Amos and Hosea and Isaiah more vivid and meaningful for us. We thank you. As you know, normally we do not like, let's say we prefer not to have announcements in the chapel period. This morning, however, because of the rearrangement of the class schedule, a special guest who was to present an announcement in Dr. Dahlquist's class did not get to do that. In consideration of him and also for those in our community who might take advantage of the matter that we're going to discuss, I'd like to ask at this particular time, Mr. Dennis.
I just want to take a couple of minutes of your time to tell you about a new service that's provided by YES, which is Youth Emergency Service. It's a 24-hour